You ever meet someone who's genuinely brilliant, deeply kind, probably the most reliable person in every room they walk into, and yet somehow they're the last one to see it? They'll spend 45 minutes helping you solve a problem they solved in 5. They'll minimize every compliment like it's their full-time job. They'll work twice as hard as everyone else just to feel like they barely belong. And if you ever point it out, they look at you like you're speaking a language they've never learned. That's not modesty. That's something much deeper. And today, we're going to talk about the psychology behind people who genuinely don't know their own worth. Because this is more common than most people realize, and more complex than anyone gives it credit for. If this kind of content speaks to you, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It genuinely helps more than you know. Now let's get into it. Here's the thing that most people get wrong. They assume that people who don't know their worth are just fishing for compliments, or they think it's a performance of humility. But the psychology tells a completely different story. These people aren't performing anything. They genuinely cannot see what others see clearly. And the reason why is both fascinating and heartbreaking. It usually starts early, long before they had the vocabulary to name what was happening. A child who was constantly compared to a sibling, a kid whose achievements were met with silence instead of celebration, a teenager who learned that being too much made people uncomfortable, so they started shrinking on purpose. The message didn't have to be spoken out loud. It rarely is. It got communicated through what was rewarded and what was ignored, through who got praised and who got passed over, through 1,000 tiny moments that the brain, in its remarkable efficiency, stitched together into a single belief: I am not quite enough. And once that belief takes root, it doesn't need watering. It grows on its own. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The brain is a pattern recognition machine. It is constantly scanning for evidence that confirms what it already believes. So when someone grows up believing they're not quite enough, their mind becomes masterfully skilled at finding proof of that belief everywhere, while simultaneously dismissing any evidence to the contrary. Give them a compliment? Their brain files it under, they're just being nice. Point out their talent? I got lucky. Celebrate their success? Anyone could have done that. This is called confirmation bias, and when it's tied to self-worth, it becomes almost self-sealing. Every win gets minimized. Every mistake gets magnified. It's like having a mental filter that only lets the negative in at full volume while turning the positive down to a whisper. And the cruelest part? They often don't realize they're doing it. It doesn't feel like distortion. It feels like clarity. It feels like they're just being realistic while everyone else is being generous. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in everyday life, because it doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like overachievement. These are the people who can never do enough, never accomplish enough, never rest long enough to feel satisfied. They're always chasing one more milestone, one more degree, one more promotion. Not from ambition exactly, but from a quiet desperation to finally feel worthy. As if there's some invisible threshold they're going to cross one day and finally feel like they've earned their place. That threshold never comes, because the feeling of worthiness doesn't live on the other side of achievement. It never did. Other times, it looks like overgiving. These are the people who say yes when they mean no, who exhaust themselves for others and then feel guilty for having any needs of their own. They've learned, somewhere along the way, that their value is contingent on their usefulness. So they make themselves endlessly available because deep down, they believe that if they stop being needed, they stop mattering. And then there's the relationship dynamic, which is maybe the most painful piece of all. People who don't know their worth tend to tolerate things they shouldn't. Not because they're weak, understand that clearly, but because their baseline for how they expect to be treated has been set low. When you grow up believing you're not quite enough, you unconsciously attract and accept relationships that confirm that belief. You stay too long. You apologize too much. You bend yourself into whatever shape someone else needs because deep down, you believe that being loved requires earning it. They'll fight relentlessly for relationships that would have already walked away from someone who knew their value. They'll accept crumbs and call it a meal because nobody ever showed them what a full table looks like. Here's the paradox, though. These same people often set extremely high standards for how they treat others. They'll show up completely, love deeply, give generously. They just struggle to believe they deserve that same energy in return. So they exist in this exhausting imbalance, pouring into others from a cup they never let anyone fill for them. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed in this conversation: the secondary wound. It's not just the original experiences that shape someone's sense of worth. It's every time they've tried to show up authentically and been met with dismissal. Every time they've spoken their truth and been told they're overreacting. Every time they've reached out and been made to feel like a burden. Those moments layer on top of each other like sediment, and over time, they stop reaching. They stop sharing. They start editing themselves down to the version of themselves that feels safest to present to the world. They become curators of a smaller self, not because they want to, but because it hurts less than being fully seen and still found lacking. There's also this fascinating relationship with self-advocacy. People who don't know their worth are often incredibly vocal advocates for everyone else. They'll negotiate fiercely on your behalf. They'll fight your corner without blinking. But ask them to advocate for themselves. Ask them to say what they need, negotiate their own salary, set a boundary that protects their own peace, and suddenly they're speaking a language that feels almost foreign. Because advocating for yourself requires believing that your needs are worth advocating for. And that's the exact belief they're still working to build. Dr. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion shed some important light here. Her studies found that people who struggle with self-worth often hold themselves to standards they would never apply to anyone they love. They speak to themselves in a voice they would never use with a friend. And here's what's interesting. This inner critic isn't there because they don't care about themselves. It's often there because somewhere along the way, being hard on themselves felt like the only form of self-protection available. If I criticize myself first, no one else's criticism can reach me. The harshness isn't cruelty, it's armor. Painful, exhausting, ultimately counterproductive armor, but armor nonetheless. So what actually shifts this? Because it's important we don't leave this conversation without talking about that. It's rarely a single moment of realization. It's not one compliment or one therapy session or one motivational video that rewires decades of patterned thinking. What actually shifts it is something more gradual and more profound. It's accumulation. It's the slow, steady experience of being in spaces where your presence is treated as valuable without conditions. Relationships where you don't have to earn love. Environments where you're allowed to make mistakes without it becoming evidence of your inadequacy. Communities where your perspective is genuinely welcomed. And it's also a very deliberate internal practice. It's catching the moment your brain dismisses a compliment and asking, what if I let that land? It's noticing when you're shrinking and choosing, just slightly, to take up a little more space. It's not grand gestures. It's microscopic rebellions against the belief system that was built without your consent. Because here's the truth that deserves to be said clearly and directly. Your worth was never something you had to earn. It was never contingent on your productivity, your perfection, your usefulness to others, or your ability to need as little as possible. It existed before your first achievement, and it will exist after your last. It is not a reward, it is a given. The people who don't know their worth aren't missing something others have. They're carrying something others placed on them, a misbelief that was never theirs to begin with. And the work, the beautiful, difficult, non-linear work, is simply the process of setting it down. They are not broken. They are not difficult. They are not too much or not enough. They are people who were handed a distorted mirror early in life and have been brave enough, in some cases for years, to keep questioning whether the reflection is actually true. And the fact that they're still here, still trying, still capable of loving others so fiercely, even when they struggle to love themselves, that says everything about their worth, even when they can't see it yet. That's not just psychology, that's the quiet heroism of being human. If this resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that join button to become a channel member. Here are some more videos I think will speak to you.